Hannity, Fox News' most ruthless interrogator. For 23 years, he's been destroying politicians live on air. Jasmine, just 32 years old and never in such a hostile environment before. Hannity expected easy prey. Instead, he experienced the biggest nightmare of his career. The evening of March 7, 2025, began with what Sean Hannity confidently believed would be one of his most satisfying television victories in over 2 decades of hosting Hannity on Fox News. At 7:47 p.m. Eastern, as his production team made final preparations for the 9 p.m. broadcast, Hannity sat in his makeup chair reviewing his interview strategy for what he had privately told colleagues would be the easiest political takedown of my career. His target, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, whom his research team had identified as the perfect victim for the kind of aggressive interrogation that had made Hannity the most feared interview host in conservative media. At 54 years old, with 23 years of experience behind the Fox News desk, Hannity had perfected a formula that had destroyed countless political careers. His method was deceptively simple: invite guests onto his show under the pretense of fair discussion, then systematically attack them with a combination of rapid-fire questions, misleading statistics, and manufactured outrage that left even experienced politicians looking foolish and unprepared. His studio audience was carefully selected to support his attacks. His questions were designed to create viral soundbites that would damage his targets for weeks, and his follow-up segments ensured that any politician who dared to challenge him would be subjected to sustained character assassination. What Hannity didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that Jasmine Crockett had spent the previous 4 months preparing for exactly this confrontation. She had studied 247 hours of Hannity's interviews, identified his attack patterns, analyzed his most effective tactics, and developed counter-strategies that would not just neutralize his advantages, but turn them into weapons against him. More importantly, she had spent those 4 months gathering documentation that would expose the most carefully guarded secrets of Hannity's career and personal life. The invitation to appear on Hannity's show had come through intermediaries in February 2025, framed as an opportunity for Jasmine to present her views to a broader audience and engage in substantive policy discussions. Hannity's producers had been careful to avoid mentioning their host's actual intentions, which involved using the interview to highlight what they saw as the inexperience and incompetence of young Democratic politicians. Internal Fox News emails, which would later become public, revealed that Hannity had described the planned interview as a shooting fish in a barrel and predicted that Jasmine would be completely out of her depth. But Jasmine had suspected Hannity's true intentions from the moment the invitation arrived. She had accepted not because she expected a fair interview, but because she saw an opportunity to implement what she privately called the Hannity Trap, a strategy designed to use the host's own aggressive tactics against him in a way that would be both devastating and permanent. The key insight driving her strategy was that Hannity's power came from his ability to control the narrative and overwhelm guests with rapid-fire attacks that left them unable to respond effectively. If she could maintain her composure while systematically dismantling his credibility, she could turn his own audience against him. The Hannity studio at Fox News headquarters in New York was designed to intimidate guests and empower the host. Hannity sat behind an imposing desk on an elevated platform, surrounded by multiple cameras and bright studio lights that made guests feel exposed and vulnerable. The audience seating was arranged so that Hannity's supporters could be seen and heard reacting to his questions, creating an atmosphere of hostility toward anyone who challenged his positions. The entire environment was calculated to make guests feel isolated and overwhelmed. As Jasmine entered the studio at 8:34 p.m., she appeared calm and professional, carrying what looked like a standard briefing folder. Inside that folder, however, were 89 pages of documentation that would soon destroy not just Hannity's interview strategy, but his entire career at Fox News. She had spent 127 days gathering this material through a combination of congressional oversight powers, Freedom of Information Act requests, and sources within the media industry who had grown tired of Hannity's bullying tactics. "Good evening, Congresswoman Crockett," Hannity began as the cameras started rolling at exactly 9:03 p.m. "Thank you for joining us tonight. I have to say, I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think the American people deserve to hear directly from young politicians like yourself about your policy positions and your qualifications for the offices you hold. The introduction was classic Hannity, ostensibly respectful while containing subtle condescension designed to position him as the adult in the conversation. His tone suggested that he was doing Jasmine a favor by allowing her to appear on his show, while the phrase, young politicians like yourself, was calculated to emphasize her inexperience and his seniority. Thank you for having me, Sean. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the important issues facing American families, Jasmine replied, her voice steady and confident. She had anticipated this opening and was prepared for the escalation she knew was coming. Well, let's dive right into those issues, Congresswoman. You've been a vocal critic of law enforcement, you've supported policies that many Americans consider radical, and you've made statements that suggest you believe America is fundamentally racist. Can you explain to our audience why they should trust someone with your extreme views to represent them in Congress? The attack was immediate and multi-pronged, exactly as Jasmine had expected. Hannity had packed 3 separate accusations into a single question, each one designed to force her into a defensive position while making her appear radical to his conservative audience. It was a technique he had used successfully hundreds of times to overwhelm guests and create viral moments that damaged their credibility. But Jasmine had anticipated this exact approach. Sean, that's an interesting way to frame those issues. But before I respond to your characterizations of my positions, I'm curious about something. You mentioned trust and representation. Do you think the American people deserve honesty from their media figures? The response was perfectly calibrated to avoid Hannity's trap while setting up her own. Instead of accepting his framing and becoming defensive, she had redirected the conversation toward questions of media integrity. Hannity, however, was experienced enough to recognize the redirection and pressed forward with his planned attack. Congresswoman, I ask the questions here. This is about your record and your fitness for office. Now, can you explain why you voted against legislation that would have increased funding for border security? Why do you think American communities should be less safe because of your political ideology? Hannity's interruption and reframing were classic intimidation tactics designed to establish his control over the interview and force Jasmine into a reactive posture. His audience was already applauding his aggressive questioning, and his facial expression conveyed the confidence of someone who had used these techniques successfully for over 2 decades. You're absolutely right that you asked the questions, Sean. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss, Jasmine said, opening her briefing folder. Because I've been researching the kinds of questions you ask and the research methods you use to prepare those questions. It's fascinating work, really. For instance, I'm curious about the sourcing behind some of your most memorable interview moments. Hannity's confident expression flickered slightly. This wasn't how his interviews usually proceeded. Guests were supposed to become defensive and flustered, not calm and investigative. Congresswoman, I'm not sure what you're getting at, but this interview is about your record, not mine. Of course it is, Sean. But since you've raised questions about trust and integrity, I thought your audience might be interested in learning about the research methods behind your questions. For instance, I have here a recording of a conversation between you and your research staff from November 15, 2024. Would you like me to play it for your audience? The studio fell completely silent. Hannity's audience, which had been enthusiastic about his attacks on Jasmine, suddenly looked confused and uncertain. Hannity himself had gone pale, clearly trying to remember what might have been said in a November research meeting that could be damaging if made public. I have no idea what you're talking about, Congresswoman, and I think it's inappropriate for you to try to. Let me help refresh your memory, Sean, Jasmine interrupted, pulling out a small digital device. This is a recording of you discussing interview strategies with your staff. In this particular conversation, you're planning an interview with Senator Elizabeth Warren, and you're discussing how to, and I quote, create sound bites that will make her look like a radical socialist, even if she gives reasonable answers. She pressed play, and Hannity's own voice filled the studio. I don't care what she actually says about healthcare policy. We need clips that make her sound like she wants to destroy capitalism. Edit her answers if you have to, but make sure we get the sound bites we need for our attack segments. The reaction in the studio was immediate and dramatic. The audience, which had been supportive of Hannity's aggressive questioning, now looked shocked and uncomfortable. Several Fox News executives watching from the control room could be seen frantically making phone calls. Hannity himself looked like he had been physically struck. "That recording is completely out of context," Hannity stammered, his usual confidence completely gone. We were discussing hypothetical scenarios." "Were you, Sean? Because I have 17 other recordings from research meetings where you discussed similar strategies for distorting interviews and creating misleading segments. Would you like to hear those as well?" Jasmine's tone remained calm and professional, which made her revelations even more devastating. She wasn't angry or vindictive. She was simply presenting documented evidence of systematic journalistic fraud. The contrast between her composure and Hannity's obvious panic was stark and damaging. "Congresswoman, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Hannity's voice was now barely above a whisper, and he was visibly sweating under the studio lights. "Oh, there's no misunderstanding, Sean. I have clear audio recordings of you explicitly discussing how to manipulate interviews to damage political figures you disagree with. But that's just the beginning. Should we talk about the coordination between your show and Republican campaign committees?" She pulled out another document from her folder. "This is an email from your producer to the communications director of Senator Ted Cruz's office, dated January 8, 2025. In this email, your producer shares advanced questions that you'll be asking Democrats during upcoming interviews, allowing Republican offices to prepare attack responses and coordinate messaging." The implications were staggering. If true, this meant that Hannity's show had been operating as an arm of Republican political campaigns rather than as an independent news program. The audience was now murmuring among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interview had taken. "That's absolutely false," Hannity said, but his voice lacked any conviction. "I would never coordinate with political campaigns. Sean, I have 47 different emails documenting coordination between your show and Republican political operations. I have records of payments from conservative PACs to shell companies that funnel money to Fox News personalities. I have documentation of your personal financial relationships with political figures you regularly interview." Jasmine's revelations were becoming more damaging with each statement. What had started as Hannity's attempt to embarrass a young politician had turned into a systematic exposure of journalistic corruption and political coordination that went to the heart of Fox News' credibility. "But let's talk about something more personal, Sean, since you seem so interested in questioning people's character and fitness for their positions," Jasmine continued, reaching for another section of her folder. "I'm curious about your own character and how it relates to your role as a moral authority for millions of Americans." Hannity's breathing was now visibly labored. He clearly had no idea what Jasmine might reveal next, and his inability to control the interview was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. "I have here a series of financial records showing payments from your personal accounts to a private investigation firm called Blackwater Research Associates. According to these records, you paid this firm $340,000 between 2022 and 2024 to conduct opposition research on Democratic politicians, their families, and their personal lives." The studio audience was now completely silent. Even Hannity's most ardent supporters seemed uncomfortable with the suggestion that he had been paying for private investigations of his political opponents. But here's the interesting part, Sean. Blackwater Research Associates didn't just investigate politicians. They investigated the personal lives of Fox News employees who had expressed concerns about your journalistic methods. They investigated reporters who had criticized your interview techniques. They even investigated family members of Fox News staff who had raised questions about your coordination with Republican campaigns. Hannity was now gripping the edge of his desk, clearly struggling to process the scope of Jasmine's revelations. I need to take a commercial break." "Of course you do, Sean. But before we break, let me ask you this. Do you think it's appropriate for a television host to use private investigators to intimidate his own colleagues? Do you think that demonstrates the kind of character and integrity that qualifies someone to question the fitness of elected officials?" The question hung in the air as Hannity desperately signaled for his production team to cut to commercial. But the damage was already done. In less than 15 minutes, Jasmine had systematically destroyed Hannity's credibility, exposed his journalistic fraud, and revealed a pattern of behavior that would end his career at Fox News. During the commercial break, chaos erupted in the Fox News control room. Network executives were conferring frantically about how to handle the revelations. Hannity was pacing behind his desk, clearly panicked about what other documentation Jasmine might reveal. His usual confidence had been completely shattered, and he appeared to be on the verge of a breakdown. When they returned from commercial, Hannity attempted to regain control of the interview, but his voice was shaky and uncertain. Congresswoman, I think there may be some misunderstandings about. Sean, let me help you understand something. Jasmine interrupted, her voice now carrying the authority that Hannity had lost. I came on your show tonight knowing exactly what you planned to do. I knew you would try to ambush me with aggressive questions designed to make me look incompetent. I knew you would coordinate with Republican operatives to create attack soundbites. I knew you would use every trick you've developed over 23 years to try to destroy my credibility. She paused, looking directly at Hannity. But what you didn't know is that I've been investigating you for 4 months. I've documented your journalistic fraud, your political coordination, and your use of private investigators to intimidate colleagues. I came here tonight not to be your victim, but to hold you accountable for years of corrupting American political discourse. The transformation was complete. Hannity, who had begun the interview as the aggressive interrogator, was now the one being held accountable. His audience, which had expected to see him destroy a young politician, was instead witnessing the destruction of their host's credibility and career. Congresswoman, Hannity's voice was barely audible. I think we should end this interview. We should, Sean. But before we do, I want to say something to your audience directly. Jasmine turned to face the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, you tune into this show because you want honest information about American politics. You deserve better than manufactured outrage, distorted interviews, and coordinated political attacks disguised as journalism. Sean Hannity has spent 23 years lying to you about his methods, his motives, and his coordination with political campaigns. He's used your trust to advance political agendas while pretending to be an independent voice. Tonight, I've provided documented evidence of that deception. You deserve media figures who respect your intelligence enough to tell you the truth. You deserve journalists who investigate stories rather than manufacturing them. And you deserve to know when the people claiming to inform you are actually working to manipulate you. With that, Jasmine stood up, gathered her materials, and walked off the set, leaving Hannity sitting alone at his desk in front of a studio audience that was now completely silent. The man who had built his career on aggressive interrogations and political takedowns had been thoroughly dismantled by an opponent who had turned his own weapons against him. The aftermath was swift and devastating. Within 3 hours of the broadcast, clips of Jasmine's revelations were viral across every social media platform. #HannityExposed was trending nationally. Media critics and journalism organizations were calling for investigations into Fox News's journalistic practices. Several major advertisers announced that they were pulling their commercials from Hannity's show pending clarification of recent allegations. By the next morning, internal Fox News emails were leaking to the press, confirming many of Jasmine's allegations about coordination with Republican campaigns and the use of private investigators. Fox News executives, facing potential federal investigations and advertiser boycotts, began distancing themselves from Hannity and his methods. 3 days after the interview, Sean Hannity announced that he was taking a temporary leave of absence to address personal and professional concerns. 2 weeks later, Fox News quietly announced that Hannity would not be returning to his primetime slot, citing mutual agreement to pursue other opportunities. The man who had been one of the most powerful voices in conservative media had been completely destroyed by a 32-year-old congresswoman who had refused to accept the role of victim in his carefully orchestrated attack. His 23-year career at Fox News was over, his credibility was permanently damaged, and his influence in conservative politics had been eliminated. 6 months after the interview, when Jasmine was asked by a journalist about her confrontation with Hannity, she reflected on its broader implications. Sean Hannity spent his career bullying politicians and distorting political discourse. He thought he could use his platform to attack anyone who challenged conservative orthodoxy. But bullies are usually cowards, and when someone stands up to them with facts and documentation, they collapse. This wasn't about destroying Hannity personally. It was about accountability in media. When journalists use their platforms to spread misinformation and coordinate with political campaigns, They betray the trust of their audiences and undermine democratic discourse. Sometimes accountability requires confronting that behavior directly and publicly. The reporter asked whether she felt vindicated by Hannity's downfall. This was never about vindication, Jasmine replied. This was about demonstrating that no media figure, no matter how powerful or influential, is immune to accountability when their behavior violates journalistic ethics and democratic values. 1 year later, the Hannity interview was being studied in journalism schools as an example of how accountability journalism could be conducted even under hostile conditions. Media ethics professors used the confrontation to teach students about the importance of documentation, preparation, and maintaining composure under pressure. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the interview was its demonstration that media figures who used their platforms to attack and intimidate others could be held accountable by opponents who were willing to do the research and preparation necessary to expose their methods. Jasmine Crockett had once again proven that careful investigation and strategic thinking could defeat even the most experienced and ruthless opponents. The woman who was supposed to be easy prey for Fox News's most aggressive host had instead become the hunter, systematically exposing years of journalistic corruption and ending a career built on manipulation and deception. Sean Hannity had learned, too late, that underestimating opponents based on their age or inexperience could be a fatal mistake when those opponents combined preparation with purpose and courage with competence.